Alright guys, this is part 3 of our genetics series, so let's go ahead and get started. So Mendel knew these pea plants that, remember, are just a single pistil from the same flower getting fertilized by the same stamen. Those are true breeding. What that means is that they're allowed to self-pollinate. They produce offspring identical to themselves. For example, if allowed to self-pollinate, all tall plants would produce tall plants. All yellow seeds would produce yellow seeds, all short plants would produce short plants, so on and so forth. So the parents are going to be exactly the same. If you don't understand true breeding plants, you're not really going to be able to discover everything that Mendel really understood. So what he did is that he joined the egg and the sperm from two different plants. So instead of allowing these plants to continue to self-pollinate, he cross-pollinated them. To do this, he had to prevent the possibility of that self-pollination. He had to make sure, okay, no more true breeding plants. We are separating those pistils from those stamen. We are removing them, and I am going to manually paint with a paintbrush the pollen from one plant onto the pistil from another. And so that's exactly what he did. He took all of the male parts, he clipped them, and then he would paint on the desired pollen onto that stamen. This is known as cross-pollination, so when you take one and cross it to another, and it creates two offspring from two different parents. Now Mendel could easily crossbreed the plants. He had control over his experiment. It was good, fundamentally strong scientifically. He was good to go. So before I want you to go, I want you to be familiar with a couple of terms. This is the major part of your vocabulary. You need to study this. You need to know this. You need to understand this. The P generation is the parental generation. That is what you start with. The F1 generation is their offspring. And the F2 generation is the offspring of those offspring. So if our P generation was your grandparents, the F1 generation would be your parents, the F2 generation would be you. Grandparents, parents, you. A hybrid is an offspring of parents with different traits. So in those pea plant examples, if you had one tall parent and one short parent, that would be a hybrid. So Mendel crossed true breeding tall plants, so a tall plant that has produced tall plant after tall plant after tall plant after tall plant when being self-pollinated with a dwarf plant or with a short plant. And again, true breeding. So he knew this is all tall, he knew that this one was all short, he knew that going in. It is called a control. And so he combined them. A tall with a short gave him all tall offspring. So every single offspring of that hybrid, every single hybrid was tall. So every cross between a tall and a short plant came out tall. The F1 hybrids, so those grandparents were tall and short, the parent was all tall. So what that means is the offspring had the appearance of only one of the two parents. The trait of the other parent seemed to have disappeared, and he thought that that dwarf trait entirely went away. It just disappeared. So he concluded that biological inheritance is determined by factors. We know those factors as genes now, but he just knew them as a factor because, remember, he didn't know anything about DNA. So they're controlled by various factors that are passed from one generation to the next. From those grandparents to that parent, that factor that said, hey, this is going to be tall, was passed on. We know these factors to be genes. Each of these genes that Mendel observed in the pea plants was controlled by one gene that occurred in two contrasting forms. So it was one gene. So one thing saying, hey, this is the height of the plant, this is the segment of DNA that says what part of the plant, or whether it's tall or not, but it came in two forms, tall and short, or tall and dwarf. This is the trait that we looked at so in depth yesterday. For example, the gene that occurs in the height of a pea plant occurs in a tall form and a dwarf form. Remember, dwarf just means short. The different forms of a gene are called alleles. We talked about that word briefly a little while ago, but you have alleles for various things, and they're just forms of a trait. So red, blonde, those are 2 different alleles. Tall, short, those are 2 different alleles. White versus yellow in flowers, that is an allele. So these are all different alleles that they looked at. So round versus wrinkled, yellow versus green, gray versus white, constricted pods versus smooth, yellow versus green, terminal versus axial, that's just where the flower is located, if it's located on the end or if it's located in the middle, and then tall or short. And what he found was when he crossed these 2 different true breeding alleles, he only got round in that F1 generation. If the grandparents were round and wrinkled, all of the parents were round. All of the parents were yellow. All were gray. All were smooth. All were green. All of them shared the same characteristics in that parent generation. So what he realized is that some alleles are dominant over others. That round pea is entirely covering up the wrinkled. The yellow is entirely covering up the green. The gray is entirely covering up the white. And that leads us to the principle of dominance and recessiveness. And the principle of dominance and recessiveness says some alleles are dominant to others, and others are recessive. The dominant allele covers up or masks that recessive allele. If the dominant allele is present in an offspring, then that's always going to show up. If there is a round seed anywhere in there, that offspring is going to have round seeds. If it is smooth pod, all of the offspring are going to be smooth. With recessive alleles, this is only going to show up if there is not a dominant allele present. The only way that you're going to get this constricted is that if there is no smooth anywhere in there. So I'm going to leave you on this question for right now. Had the dwarf trait, the recessive allele, really disappeared, or was it still present in the F1 generation? I want you to take a minute, fill in those notes, think about this question, and I'll see you in a couple slides.